August 15th, 1971, Camp David, Maryland. Richard Nixon sits across from his advisors and makes a decision that will echo for generations. He closes the gold window. In that moment, he doesn't just change monetary policy, he flips a switch on a system that was already being built. Around you, around all of us, a system designed not to be escaped. And nobody understood at the time that this wasn't the beginning, it was just the moment the door locked. I spent 6 months pulling apart declassified documents, central bank reports, surveillance timelines, academic papers on complex adaptive systems, and historical debt crises most people will never read. I traced the fingerprints of this system back through a century of decisions, each one tightening the architecture. What I found isn't a conspiracy, it's worse. It's a pattern, a sequence that repeats with mechanical precision across economies, across generations, across every attempt to break free, and the numbers don't lie. So here's the real question. Not whether this system exists, but whether you can see it operating right now, in your life, in your choices, in the debt you carry, and the screen you're staring at, because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And the question that should terrify you is this: if this system was designed, if it's already inescapable, then what happens to people like you when the final stage kicks in? Let me show you what I mean, because this isn't abstract, this is about your mortgage, your savings, your future, and the invisible mechanisms that control all three. Right now, global debt sits at $251 trillion, which is 235% of world GDP. Public debt alone is $99.2 trillion. In the United States, government debt is 121% of GDP, and in China, 88%. These aren't just numbers, they're chains, and here's what makes them inescapable. The interest payments on that debt have more than doubled in the last decade for low and middle income countries, forcing governments to choose between paying creditors and funding schools, hospitals, infrastructure. The system ensures there's only one choice. Pay the debt. Always pay the debt. But debt is just one lock on the cage, and the other is attention. In 2025, global average screen time hit 4.6 hours per day, up 20% since 2022. Americans check their phones 144 times a day, which means every 10 minutes you're awake. About 6% of the global population is addicted to the internet, and among teenagers, it's 25%. And 48% of American internet users in 2022 admitted they're addicted to their devices. This isn't accidental. AI-driven recommendation systems create personalized feedback loops that deepen dependency with every scroll. And the system doesn't need guards anymore, it has algorithms, and you carry them in your pocket. So how did we end up in a system this fragile, this controlling, without anyone noticing? Let's go back, not to 1971, but earlier, to 1895 when New York City police began wiretapping phones to listen in on criminals. By 1916, hundreds of phones are tapped every year, legislates a national fingerprint database, and by 1946, it holds 100 million records. Surveillance isn't new, but in 1942, something changes when Nazi Germany installs the first operational CCTV system, designed by Walter Brooke to monitor V-2 rocket tests. By 1951, the first commercial CCTV system goes live in America, sold by Vericon. And then in 1956, the videotape recorder hits the market, and for the first time, surveillance isn't just watching, it's recording. It's permanent. By the 1960s, police departments across the UK and US are deploying cameras in public spaces. Liverpool in 1964, London transport stations in 1961. In 1966, Marie Van Britten Brown invents the home security system, bringing surveillance into private life. The architecture is being built brick by brick, camera by camera, and nobody's asking where it leads because at every stage it feels reasonable, safer, more efficient. But here's the pattern underneath all of this, and once you see it, it explains everything. There are 7 stages to building an inescapable system, not theory, but documented, repeated. Let me walk you through them. Stage 1, create dependency on a resource the system controls. It starts with something valuable like gold-backed currency, credit, internet access, employment. The resource feels neutral, even empowering, but control over it is centralized. When Nixon closed the gold window, he didn't just end convertibility, he made the dollar a fiat currency, controlled entirely by central banks with no external anchor and no escape valve. From that point forward, every dollar you hold is a claim on a system you don't control. Stage 2, normalize surveillance and data collection under the guise of safety or convenience. CCTV for crime prevention, credit scores for loan efficiency, social media for connection. In Sao Paulo, facial recognition systems blocked over 300,000 transit benefit cards for alleged misuse, disproportionately impacting the most vulnerable. In Chile, the Alerta Niñas tool assigns statistical risk scores to children, determining intervention without transparency. Every data point collected is a thread in the web, and you hand it over willingly because the trade feels reasonable. Stage 3, use debt and financial obligation to constrain choice, because once you owe, you can't walk away. In low and middle income countries, debt servicing now consumes budgets that should fund development. In advanced economies, private debt exceeds 140% of GDP in the US, 206% in China. Individuals carry mortgages, student loans, credit card balances, and each one is a tether, each one a calculation that limits your ability to quit, to move, to resist. Debt doesn't just constrain resources, it constrains time, and your future labor is already spoken for. Stage 4, exploit psychological vulnerabilities to manufacture consent. You don't realize you're trapped because the system makes you believe you're free. Algorithmic feeds curate your reality, showing you content that confirms your biases and deepens engagement. While fear appeals during crises drive compliance and social pressure enforces conformity. And here's the mechanism. Nearly half the population experiences manipulation in their lifetime, with victims 3 times more likely to develop depression and anxiety. The system doesn't force you, it nudges you, it exhausts you, it makes resistance feel irrational. Stage 5. Punish escape attempts swiftly and visibly. In 1984, there were 7,903 prison escapes in the US, and over 80% of escapees were recaptured with an average additional sentence for escape of 12 to 14 months. But in extreme cases, like Timothy Clausen in Nebraska, escape added 80 to 140 years to his sentence. The math is clear. The cost of trying to leave far exceeds the cost of staying. This applies beyond prisons because if you try to live off-grid, you'll face zoning laws, tax penalties, loss of access to banking, healthcare, employment. The system doesn't need to catch everyone. It just needs to make examples visible enough to deter the rest. Stage 6. Make ignorance rational and information overwhelming. Political ignorance in the US is staggering because only 37 to 42% of Americans demonstrate basic understanding of government structure or major policies. And it's rational since the probability that one informed vote changes an election outcome is infinitesimal. So why invest the effort? Add to that willful ignorance, 40% of people consciously avoid learning how their actions affect others. The system benefits when you don't understand it because complexity is a feature, not a bug. And while 74% of people say controlling their personal data is important, over 90% believe they've already lost that control. So they stop trying. Stage 7. Accelerate dependency to the point where collapse and control become indistinguishable. We're here now. In 2025, the system isn't just embedded in institutions, it's embedded in your nervous system. You check your phone 144 times a day, your mortgage payment is automated, your identity is verified by algorithms you don't control, and your attention is auctioned in milliseconds to the highest bidder. And when you feel anxious, when you feel trapped, the system offers you the same tools that trapped you as the solution. More screen time, more debt, more compliance. So which stage are we actually in right now? Look around. Global debt is at record highs and still climbing. Surveillance infrastructure is omnipresent from Ring, doorbells to facial recognition at airports, to the phone in your hand. The average American spends over 5 hours a day on their phone, and that number is rising. Teens who spend 5 or more hours on devices are 71% more likely to show suicide risk factors. And yet we keep scrolling because the system has trained us to seek the dopamine hit, to fear missing out, to stay connected. Disconnection feels like death. In education, the system conditions acceptance early because poor school infrastructure directly lowers test scores. Schools with inadequate cooling systems see a 3% drop in reading scores, 5% in math, and each fortnight rain wave increase in temperature without air conditioning reduces learning by 1% annually. And these schools are disproportionately attended by low-income students, Black and Hispanic students, which teaches them early that they don't deserve the same resources, the same outcomes. And when half of US school districts need urgent HVAC upgrades but funding never comes, the message is clear. This is normal. Accept it. But here's what keeps people from seeing it: rational ignorance, willful blindness, cognitive depletion. When you're tired, overwhelmed, or scared, critical thinking shuts down, and the system knows this because fear appeals work. During COVID-19, fear messaging combined with self-efficacy instructions drove compliance. Social pressure amplifies this because social anxiety, the persistent fear of negative evaluation, affects over 10% of the global population at some point, which makes people conform to avoid disapproval. And in doing so, they enforce the system on each other. What does this actually mean for someone with a mortgage, a job, and a shrinking paycheck? It means you're already inside the mechanism where your choices feel like choices, but the boundaries were set long before you made them. You can choose which job, but you need a job. You can choose which bank, but you need a bank. You can choose which phone, but you need a phone. The illusion of choice masks the absence of exit. And when you feel the walls closing in, when the debt payment is due and the rent is rising, and the screen time is creeping up, you don't rebel. You adapt. You optimize within the system because leaving feels impossible. And it is impossible, not physically, but practically, economically, psychologically. In 1981, there were nearly 13 prison escapes per 1,000 inmates, but by 2001, it was less than 1. Not because prisoners became less desperate, but because the system became better at containment. The same dynamic applies outside prison walls where the system has gotten better at making escape unthinkable. But some people do escape, right? About 3.4 million high-achieving students from lower-income families overcome systemic educational disadvantages, and 93% graduate on time while over 90% pursue college. But here's the catch. Their outcomes depend on which college, since graduation rates drop from 90% at elite institutions to 56% at less selective ones. The system allows some to climb, but only if they play by its rules, attend its institutions, adopt its values. Escape isn't freedom, it's assimilation. If you know the pattern is real, what do you do with that knowledge? Let's talk about what comes next, because if the pattern holds, there are 3 plausible paths from here. First, controlled acceleration where debt keeps rising, surveillance deepens, technology tightens the feedback loops, but the system maintains enough stability to prevent mass revolt. You feel the squeeze, but you adjust as central banks intervene when necessary and governments bail out critical sectors. Life gets harder, but it doesn't collapse, which means you work longer hours for less purchasing power and accept more monitoring for the promise of security. This is the slow boil. Second, Systemic rupture, where the math breaks, interest payments consume too much of too many budgets, a major economy defaults, and confidence evaporates, credit freezes, supply chain seize. It happens fast, not in years but weeks, because historical precedent says once confidence breaks, cascades are brutal and indiscriminate. In 1929, the market wiped out fortunes in a single week, and in 2008, Lehman Brothers collapsed over a weekend, and nearly took the global financial system with it. If stage 7 accelerates into rupture, the system doesn't gently release you. It thrashes, and those on the margins, those already stretched thin, go under first. Third, technological capture, where AI and surveillance technologies advance to the point where the system doesn't need your compliance, because it predicts and preempts resistance. Social credit systems expand, digital currencies allow real-time monitoring and control of every transaction. And dissent becomes not just punished, but algorithmically filtered out before it spreads. China's advancing AI capabilities give a preview, and organized social media manipulation campaigns now operate in 81 countries, up 15% in 1 year. The system learns faster than you do, and once it's embedded in the infrastructure of daily life, there is no offline. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds like fear-mongering. This sounds like we're powerless. And you'd be right to push back, because here's what the system doesn't want you to know. Every pattern can be interrupted. Not easily and not without cost, but it's possible. Historically, systems do collapse when the math becomes unsustainable, but they collapse chaotically, painfully, and the people who suffer most are those who never saw it coming. The question isn't whether the system can be dismantled, it's whether it can be dismantled intentionally, thoughtfully, before it collapses on its own terms. And that requires something the system actively discourages: awareness. Because here's the thing, if everyone suddenly woke up and rejected this system, society wouldn't transform peacefully, since research on social rejection shows that exclusion increases negative emotions, impulsivity, stress, and people with less power suffer disproportionately. Mass rejection of systemic norms would fracture social cohesion, erode trust, potentially trigger widespread conflict. The system survives partly because rejection itself is so painful, and we are social creatures who need belonging. The system leverages that need ruthlessly, but knowledge is different from rejection, because you don't have to reject the system to protect yourself within it. You have to see it clearly, recognize the mechanisms, understand that debt is a chain, that screen time is a leash, that ignorance is cultivated, that fear is weaponized. Once you see the pattern, you can make different choices, not perfect choices and not escape, but informed choices about how much of yourself you're willing to trade for the illusion of security. So let's go back to where we started. August 15th, 1981, when Nixon closes the gold window and the door locks. But nobody hears the click, because the room is familiar, the lights are on, and the system promises stability, prosperity, progress. And for a while, it delivers until the debt compounds, until the surveillance normalizes, until the screen time becomes compulsory, until you look up one day and realize you can't remember the last time you made a choice that wasn't already bounded by someone else's algorithm, someone else's debt structure, someone else's definition of normal. 7 times this pattern has played out in different forms across history, and 7 times the people living through it thought they were different, thought they were immune. 7 times the math proved them wrong. The difference between them and us is simple. We can see the pattern now, we know what stage we're at, and we know what comes next. The question is whether knowing is enough, whether we'll act on what we know, or whether we'll become the 8th example in this pattern. The one future historians point to and say they had all the information, they saw it coming, and they still couldn't escape. Look, I can't tell you exactly when the acceleration hits, because it could be 5 years or it could be 15. But I can tell you this, when it happens, it'll happen fast, just like 1929 and just like 2008. And when it does, everyone will ask, how did this happen? And you'll already know, because the answer's been sitting in the pattern this whole time. So if you want to understand what's coming, if you want to see the signs before everyone else does, you need to subscribe. Because when the system tightens, when the debt math breaks, when the surveillance becomes undeniable, the explanations won't be in the headlines. They'll be buried in the history most people never read and the patterns most people never see. And by then, it'll be too late to ask the question, because you'll already be living the answer.